All right, you're live.
Good afternoon, everyone. So many people today. Thank you for attending today's talk. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Deepu Murty, an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at University of Oregon. Dr. Murty completed his PhD at Duke University, followed by postdoctoral training at NYU, and recently was a faculty member at Temple University. Dr. Murty's research examines how the engagement of the neuromodulatory system support memory and memory-guided decision-making across a range of motivational and affective states. His work focuses on modeling these processes in both normative and clinical population, including individuals with psychosis and stress-related disorders. His research has been supported by multiple funding agencies like NIMH, NIDA, NSF, and Behavioral and Brain Research Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Deepu Murty.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm also a little nervous because there's a lot of people in this room that know more about the stuff I'm talking about than I do, but I'm gonna reframe that as really exciting. It'll make the work better. Also, I put my title into ChatGPT this morning, and it made this picture, which is going to be way more exciting than the talk I'm about to give, but I thought I'd open it. Okay, so there's a lot of memory researchers in the room, and there's a lot of memory researchers in the world, and one thing that we obsess a lot about is memory selectivity, right? So why do we remember some information but let other information fall to the wayside of forgetting, right? Like I said, lots of people study this question, and there's been a ton of beautiful work examining these things. We've identified a lot of factors that can drive memory selectivity. So when things are negative or aversive, right, we'll have better memory for a snake that we encountered in the woods than some random cup we see in our house. It's not limited to negative things. You see an adorable puppy in a park, it sticks with you forever. Whereas if you see a stupid cat, it doesn't. And it's not just emotional information. I really need to stop dissing cats. It's not just emotional information. It can also be things that are unexpected or surprising, right? Something sort of surprises you, it gets embedded in long-term memory. Now, this work is gorgeous and is inspired like most of what I do, but one limitation of this body of work is that it's often centered on the outside world, right? This item is intrinsically negative. This puppy is intrinsically adorable, right? But memory is also reflected by our goals and desires. We hold things in our head. They're going to filter the way we see the world, which in turn is going to have downstream consequences on what we do and don't remember. So a great example of this is I talk to my nephew a lot on the phone. We both have Nintendo Switches. The first game he got was Super Mario Odyssey, and he would go on for hours about Super Mario Odyssey. I don't play this game. I remember nothing from this conversation. I am totally uninterested into it. Then for Christmas, I bought him Overcooked because that's a game that I play. He got much, much better at it than I do, and now I remember everything he says about it because it gives me hints on how to play the game better, right? And it's only because I idiosyncratically happen to play Overcooked and not Mario Odyssey that I'm forming more memories of Overcooked, right? So in this way, memory is adaptive. And today I want to sort of speculate a lot and wave my hands to sort of think about this idea of adaptive memory and what it means. So first, I'm going to give a little bit of history that sort of set the groundwork for what we're thinking about. And then I'm going to show you some new data that I've never presented before. So we'll see how that goes on how we're trying to capture this adaptive memory process. Okay, so the big question across the whole thing is going to be how do we use our goal states to transform our experiences into adaptive memories? Acknowledging right now that the idea of adaptive memories is a little fuzzy, and we'll try to refine it as we go along. Okay. So first, let's start with the brain. We know that the medial temporal lobe, including the hippocampus, is critical for forming episodic memory. So if we're thinking about adaptive memories, this is one place to think about. In parallel, we know that there's dopamine neurons in the VTA whose evolutionary job is to detect rewards, to detect salient items in the environment, and then use that to translate goals into actions, right? So we have a system for goal states and we have a system for memory. What's nice is the hardware is set up for these two things to interact. Dopamine neurons in the VTA project directly to the hippocampus. And importantly, we know that if you put dopamine in the hippocampus, it can actually facilitate episodic memory or hippocampal dependent memories, both by enhancing encoding. So when the information is coming in real time, and consolidation, the processes that are happening after encoding that stabilize and transform memories, right? So the circuit is set up. A lot of time is spent by a lot of people in the field studying this circuit. So when we move to humans, what a lot of people have used is monetary rewards to study these processes of how value and memory can intersect. So imagine you're going shopping with a friend who's making their wedding registry. So you're walking around Williams and Sonoma with that little gun that you can tag things with. You're also thinking like, oh, I need to buy them a gift too. So you might be attending to all the things that they find rewarding, and those are things that you should find memorable, right? And a huge body of work now for decades has shown that we have better memory for items that are associated with reward or associated with value compared to information that isn't, right? Bringing it back to the neuroscience, as early as 2006, Alison Adcock did a study where she sort of used a sledgehammer to study this process, where she showed people scenes and said, I'll give you $5 to remember some scenes, 10 cents to remember other scenes. Of course, people remembered the $5 scenes more than the 10-cent scenes. But what was interesting is that she also found that correlated activity between the VTA, the home of these dopamine neurons, and the hippocampus predicted memory for high reward information more than low reward information, only if it was successfully remembered, right? So we're seeing an intersection of reward and memory, and it was driven by this VTA hippocampal circuit. Cool. Okay, so in some ways, the story stayed here for quite a while, right? It's like, oh, look, we got the animal models, check, right? We're getting better memory, check. And then more and more work was being done, but it was really sort of confined to this space. And it's like, oh, this makes sense, right? We're remembering this stuff because it has more value, and then we need that information later. But then when I started postdoc and was getting into my own faculty position, I was just thinking about this idea of like, how do you really make an adaptive memory? Like in some ways it's good to just remember things that are directly associated with value and forget other things, but the system sort of needs to do better than that, right? That's a really rigid system to just stamp in memories that are associated with reward and let it have that. So really the reason I was thinking about this is because identical events rarely occur, right? We're often not placed in the exact same situation and be like, oh, I remember this very specific thing that's associated with value. Let's do it again. Rather, the world needs more wiggle room, right? You want things that can help things like generalization and inference from prior experiences so we can take our old knowledge and move them into new spaces. In this way, like higher order associations may be more flexible and broadly usable in the context of decision-making compared to individual episodes. And this has been shown in a ton of work from decision-making, speaking about people knowing stuff more than I do that I'm putting on my slides. But there's great work from Ming Su and Carolina Lempert showing that rather than specific episodes, it really seems like people are using higher order information like heuristics or conceptual knowledge or semantics and integrating this to shape value when they're making decisions, right? So we know people are using this information to make decisions, and we think we're embedding value in the memory to support this type of decision making. There should be more than just mass increases in accuracy according to value. And this was something that we started to want to tackle, right? So if we go back to, so now the question is, does reward motivation facilitate higher order structure beyond or perhaps instead of vertical memory, just stamping in the memory as you encode it? Cool. Oh, I start to talk really fast, and the only way to slow me down is to ask me a question. Or like wave your finger at me or something, and then I can remind myself to slow down. Okay, so let's go back to this example, right? Where the way we were thinking about it included was that you just sort of enhance memory for the stuff that's associated with value, let the stuff that was low value sort of fade away into the background. But what if we just didn't store it in by stamping it in, but rather we set it up more with higher order knowledge, right? One feature you might notice amongst the items that were remembered is that they had to do with things that might be in the kitchen, right? And then you could take that information and then associate it with prior knowledge that you have, so other kitchen supplies, or more broadly, semantically, like, oh, this person likes kitchen items, right? In some ways, this is much more of a flexible way to encode value because it can expand beyond direct experiences. So one of the first studies we ran trying to sort of extend our knowledge of how reward might be impacting memory was to go back to a really classic paradigm used in psychology, the DRM paradigm, which looks at false memories. So if you're not familiar with this paradigm, what happens is you see a lot of semantically related words, but you don't see the one word that they're most associated with. So you would see bed, tired, rest, and dream, but you were never shown the word sleep. And often when people are asked to recall information or even do recognition memory on this, they will endorse that they saw the word sleep before because they saw so many semantic associates with it. So we took this paradigm and adapted it for reward. So what we did is we gave people either a green star or a gray star before each mini list of semantically related items. Green stars were working towards earning a $5 bonus at the end of the study. Gray stars were working towards a 10-cent bonus at the end of the study. We didn't tell them how many stars they need to earn because we didn't want them calculating in their head. We just wanted to sort of ramp up motivation for the green star list. And then they encoded the information. Then either immediately after encoding with the 5-minute distractor or 24 hours later, they went through a free recall period where they could recall as many words as they could from the encoding session. And then we also had them do recognition memory, where they saw both the words that were encoded, the conceptual lures that often evoke false memories, and unrelated words that they had never seen before to test their memory recognition. Cool. Any questions so far? This is my first time presenting this data to more than 2 people. Okay, awesome. So what did we find? We were interested in 2 types of memory then, veridical memory, so information that was actually on the list that they saw, and then false memories, which is for the critical lures. We can look at this both as a function of recall and recognition, and we limited it to high confidence recognition. And then I'm going to show you green bars are the ones that were associated with high reward information. Gray bars are the things associated with low reward information. So let's start with veridical memory and see if we replicate decades of findings, and we do. People have better memory for the high reward information, both at the immediate test and the delayed test. It doesn't matter if we use recall or high confidence recognition memory, we see this effect. Now, the next critical test, though, is does this transfer over to false memories, right? If we don't see this effect in false memories, it means, okay, we're keeping really crisp memories that aren't going to be prone to generalization. But if we see this effect in false memories, it means that maybe we're actually storing a fuzzier representation that's closer to concepts or semantics rather than a discrete episode. And what we see is that there's actually a very robust effect on false memories too. So simultaneously, reward was enhancing veridical memory and false memory. This is starting to suggest that the same mechanism might be driving both. But a better way to look at this is to actually look across individuals, right? So do subjects that show more false memories that's on the y-axis, are those the same subjects that are showing more reward memory benefits on the x-axis, right? And what we see is both across recall and recognition, there's a positive relationship between these 2 features. It's much stronger in the context of recognition than recall, but we're seeing individuals that have bigger effects of reward on veridical memory are also having bigger effects on false memories. So this was exciting to us and started to show, okay, maybe it's not these super crisp representations that are getting embedded in memory, but something that is more prone to generalization, right? But one thing we thought is, are we just breaking the paradigm? You know, where this is the first time we're using purely semantically loaded lists, so maybe people are taking a totally different strategy. What I'm showing here has nothing to do with the rest of the reward memory literature that was looking at idiosyncratic stimuli. So we followed up with a second study where now the lists were intermixed of conceptually related items and conceptually unrelated items, which were unrelated words. So you can see the sleep words embedded in here, bed and tired, but now we have words like affair and painter on there too. So now we can look at memory for both semantically related information and semantically unrelated information. Okay, I'm just going to show you the free recall data, but we see the same pattern of results when we look at high confidence recognition memory also. So now we replicate the findings for veridical memory. So now higher on the y-axis here means a bigger reward effect or not. And you can see that the orange bars and the red bars are well above 0, which means there's significant reward effects, but there's no differences between the conceptually related and unrelated information. We still maintain the effect on false memories too for the conceptual allures, and there's a positive relationship between the reward memory benefit and the conceptual benefit. So this is just accruing evidence that the representations that we're storing in memory might be, I'm really struggling to find the word to describe it, but I think I'll use the word just concept semantics or fuzzy a lot. And then maybe at the Q&A, we can pick which one I should start using. Cool. Yeah.
Very quick point. I think there's quite a body of evidence showing that the DRM paradigm probability of false memory correlates with the accuracy of veridical memory. Are you showing anything different than that here?
Yes, we show it. Oh, are we showing anything different than it just scaling completely?
They'll vary for accuracy of veridical memory. Do you
So
see
we
a false effect?
run it with covariating for overall memory for the person, but not talking about the accuracy differences against high and low reward. But that would still be susceptible to this effect. And I'm fine with that, right? Like,
Okay.
I think that's the point we're trying to make, is that what we're claiming are true memories are often a little bit fuzzier. So if you're scaling it up with reward, you're scaling up the ability to have false memories.
Nothing special about reward. I could have scaled it up any other way and got the same result.
What is interesting is we don't see the exact same patterns with threat, which I
Okay.
could talk about in the Q&A. So it's not just all better memory. It's sort of the type of memory that you're driving. Okay. So in the case of the DRM, you have all this pre-existing prior knowledge that's embedded in there, and you might be tapping into that resource of prior knowledge. But sometimes we don't necessarily have prior knowledge that can organize all the events together. So can we use value in and in itself as a way to categorize information on the fly, making de novo concepts as you go, right? So imagine you went shopping now too, and they get the pitcher and the shovel and an iron and a fan. There's not anything that's sort of really embedded in there, but perhaps during retrieval, they still connect these things in memory so they're closer together. And now that you can see them together and they're organized this way, you can tell that this person's plotting murder, right? Or you can start to make other assumptions of how they're binding their information because you're able to make a category on the fly. So we now want to see, does it have to always be embedded in prior knowledge, or can you use value as sort of a semantic concept on its own to organize information around? So to do this, we use a pretty simple paradigm. We took our standard, random word list paradigm associated again with high or low rewards. But what we did now is, instead of testing with recognition memory, like, did you see this item or not? We just used free recall, right? So we said, tell us all the information that you can remember. And then we scored that. So the first question is, did we see differences in accuracy? There should be no big surprise yet, but we see better memory for the high reward items versus low reward items. This is not the interesting part of the study. This is just replicating that it's happened before. What free recall gives you is that now you can sort of move beyond accuracy. So not do you remember it or not, but you can get some insight into how the organization of structure or memory is existing in your head, because it's going to come out the way that you're organizing it internally, right? So two ways we can look at it that are sort of standard in the field of the free recall world is we can look at temporal organization of memory, where you just spit out the information the same way that it came in. In some ways, this really reflects the idea of veridical memory. The same way it comes in is exactly the same way it comes out. The other way, which we were more interested in, was this idea of categorical organization, right? So if you give people lists of words that come from two semantic categories, when they're recalling it, they'll cluster the semantic categories together because they have all this prior knowledge. We were then asking, does the same thing happen for value? You end up organizing all the information around a certain value feature together. So when we look at temporal clustering, there was no difference between high and low reward, right? So reward wasn't doing anything to temporal clustering. But then we asked another question, is if you started with a high reward item, what was your likelihood of then recalling next another high reward item? Versus if you started with a neutral item, what was your likelihood of recalling another neutral item again? If you're clever in following this, you'd be like, duh, of course this is happening because they have recalled more high reward items than low reward items. So just by probability, there should be more clustering around high reward. We corrected for all of this in an overly complicated way of 3 different types of corrections to make sure accuracy wasn't being infused in this by running simulations in real time of what's the probability likelihood if you have this much in retrieval that you'd move from one space to another. So what I'm showing you is corrected state transition probability. So accuracy is factored out of this analysis. And what we find is that there's a higher state probability for high reward information versus low reward information, suggesting that they're clustering this high reward information together in memory more so than low reward. We ran this study, you can see, during the pandemic, where we didn't have any access to imaging other humans or joy. And what do you do when you don't have humans imaging or joy? You switch to computational modeling. So we wanted to get insight into what might be happening in the brain that is causing this type of clustering. So we turned to a model that I really like. I used to hate it in my youth. I said I would never do computational modeling, but this is a model that was developed by Mike Kahana and Sean Pollan adapted it quite a bit. And it's called the context maintenance and retrieval model. I'm just going to walk through it a little bit because I think not everybody's steeped in free recall world. But what this model is there's this like nebulous thing called temporal context that just sort of drifts in your head as you're moving through the world, right? When you encode items, you end up binding those items to this drifting context as you move through the world. Now, this was a model of free recall. One of the things they really wanted to explain is why do people recall information in the same order that they encoded it in? So how CMR does this is that when you recall an item, it actually reactivates the context that it was embedded in. And then by reactivating that, it basically puts you closer in mental space to the next item occurred because it's a slowly drifting context, right? So then you're more likely to transition to B. That would reactivate the B context, which then puts you closer to C. And that's how you end up calling things up in order. Does it make sense? It took me about 10 years to understand this model, so I'm totally comfortable if it doesn't make sense, and we can talk about it later. Okay, so they made this baseline model, and all it could really handle was this ability to move forward in space, but then they started adding more modifications of it to make it more flexible. So the modifications they add is you can add a source memory layer, which is I'm not only binding things to temporal context, but I'm also going to have another layer in the model that reflects source, right? And here we coded source as whether it was high information or low reward information. They also have something called learning rate, and learning rate is just like how strongly am I embedding this in the context, right? You can imagine a world like, oh, this is just coming from memory strength. That would be what it would look like, is that you're binding it more into the context, so then it's easier to retrieve. The third thing they have is drift rate, which is how fast is the context moving. If the drift rate's fast, that means temporal context is moving really fast. So even though 2 items were encoded next to each other, they're very far apart in mental space. So what we want to do is we ran a bunch of simulations, basically manipulating all of these different factors. And then we used our behavioral data to say which simulation best suited our data to garner some insight into what is happening mechanistically to generate this pattern of results. And when we did that, we found that the winning model was when we combined learning rate and source layers together. So not only are things getting encoded stronger, but importantly, you needed it bound to a source context to generate this organization of memory around value while also accounting for context. Now, given this is a really indirect way of trying to probe what's happening mechanistically, but it was giving a sense that it wasn't just sort of stamping in accuracy, but it's giving some type of structure or organization memory to give this structure. One thing, too, is that this doesn't work for threat. So it's not motivation uniformly. We get a very different pattern of results when we're associating words with punishments rather than words.
Just looking at this, and it's not perfect, but if we want it to look perfectly, so the accuracy is best predicted compared to the clustering, isn't the clustering more of the evidence of the category?
Yeah. So you mean why are we overshooting on the clustering? Yeah, I had that same concern in the competition where I was like, no, this is great. Like, you're doing a good job. So I think in this world of simulations, you're just doing really loose patterning. In the ideal world, rather than running simulations, we would fit the model to the data that we have and then look at the parameter space. but you need like so much data to fit it. So yeah, we could not get for the life of us to get that source clustering to go down.
Is that done on a subject level or only on the group?
This is done on simulating data at the subject level and then recompiling it together. Yeah. But we're trying to think of paradigms that we can use now to actually fit the modeling directly. Cool. Okay, we good so far? Okay, so as a summary, we're seeing that individual structure rewarding memories around higher order concepts. These concepts can either reflect prior knowledge or de novo categories that they construct on the fly. And then the model is suggesting that it's achieved by binding these memories around knowledge, right? So we got really interested in this question then because the pandemic ended and we could start scanning again. Where is this type of storage happening, right? We felt pretty confident that these things are becoming clustered together, but there's some open questions that remain. The first question is, I felt so strongly in my deepest heart of hearts that this was an encoding phenomena, but I also say that about everything because I like encoding more than retrieval. No offense to the retrieval people in the room. I get memories of unified process. I was like, this is definitely happening in encoding, and everybody else was like, nah, it's probably retrieval, right? So one question we had is, can we find evidence for this clustering as early as encoding that it's about information coming in that gives this type of structure? And then the next question is, where is it happening, right? You can have a lot of different theoretical frameworks guessing where this type of clustering might occur in the brain, and we were interested in that because that gives us insight into the mechanisms that are underlying it. So what we did is we ran a study where we again did this motivated remembering paradigm. In this one, you saw items on the screen with explicit value. 8, 9, and 10 were the high reward values. 1, 2, and 3 were the low reward values. Again, if you earned enough points, you would achieve a bonus. So people were more motivated for the high reward values versus the low ones. What is also important in this paradigm is that we had 4 runs of it, so we could do RSA more properly by not worrying about across-run compounds in the data. And we did an immediate item recognition test because the student had to finish her dissertation in 2 months. So we weren't ready for a 24-hour, which is like a bummer that I'm letting you know now that we didn't have delayed memory, but it's all immediate memory retrieval in this paradigm. Okay, so now the big question we have in hand is that we wanted to understand how these individual items were being represented, and ideally were the high reward items being represented closer to each other than low reward items. So to do this, we took a representational similarity analysis approach, which I imagine a lot of you in this room are familiar with because I know a lot of papers from this unit uses this approach, but I'll go through it briefly. But the idea is we look at the similarity of patterns of individual items, and then we were able to split these up on 2 dimensions. First, whether the item was associated with a high reward or whether it's associated with a low reward. And then the second is whether that item was subsequently remembered or forgotten. So what you end up doing is you take each individual item, extract a pattern from the brain. We're doing all of our comparisons of patterns across runs, which is important. And then once you have these individual pattern representations, you're basically running simple correlations across them to see how similar they are as the function of the metric that you're using. For people that are deep divers into the room, I have a lot of reasons why I don't like RDM approaches, so I didn't do that, and we approach this using multi-level modeling. We're only looking at the trials of interest when we're looking at the data. And I'm happy to nerd out methods-wise for people that disagree with that. Okay, everybody on board? So where do we look to start looking for these patterns? The first thing we looked at was in the hippocampus. We had some predictions just based off of prior literature that there might be differences along the long axis of the hippocampus. Everybody and their mother and their father have a different theory about what the long axis is doing. If I can tally in my head, there's at least like 10 different theories about the long axis. So you can sort of like go to the candy shop and pick the theories that you want when you're making predictions about long axis. But the 2 that really struck out to me is Brian Strange and the Mosers have, so this is like a Nobel Prize endorsed model, have a model that the anterior might be more oriented towards affective information, while the posterior hippocampus is more oriented towards neutral information. There's also these really cool evidence that place cells in the hippocampus are larger in the anterior hippocampus, and then they're smaller in the posterior hippocampus. For rodent enthusiasts, anterior maps onto ventral, posterior maps onto dorsal hippocampus. So if you sort of fuse these together, you might make a general idea that the posterior hippocampus would be representing information in more detail with higher resolution that is more neutral, while the anterior hippocampus would be representing things more in a just-like fashion with lower resolution, and that information would be more, right? So the first thing we wanted to look at were these two regions. So I'm going to show you the anterior hippocampus on the left, the posterior hippocampus in the right. For some reason, the standard in the field plot similarity. Another way to think about this is lower bars mean they're more similar to each other. And in the way we're thinking about it, that means they're represented closer to each other in mental space, where higher on the bar means they're represented further apart. Okay, so when we look in the anterior hippocampus, we see two main effects that are both exciting. First, we see that high reward information independent of memory is represented closer to each other than low reward information, which is represented further apart. Furthermore, we see that there's higher, I can't use the word clustering. Things are more similar to each other when they're successfully remembered versus when they're forgotten, right? So in some ways, the anterior hippocampus is storing all the information one would need to construct the types of behavioral patterns that we have, but in and in itself, it is not constructing it that way, right? It's holding both pieces of information, but you critically don't see an interaction where it's doing it differently for the high reward information versus the low reward information, right? So in terms of finding a neural target for our behavioral phenomenon, it's like a solid B-, right? But like, we want to go for the A+, right? So we look at posterior hippocampus, we see no effective memory in the posterior hippocampus. We see the like whisper of a trend that it's representing high reward information more similarly to each other than low reward information, but this is a really weak effect. So walking away from this, we're like, okay, maybe this is not purely a hippocampal phenomenon. If it is, it's probably anterior, but it's probably not fully a hippocampal phenomenon. So then my best friend from grad school, Maureen Ritchie, came out with what I think is a really beautiful framework with Char and Rangana that like we're too obsessed with the hippocampus. Like, time to let it go. The brain's bigger than just this one medial temporal lobe structure. And they started talking much more about these large-scale memory networks that work in concert together and might represent different features of episodic memory. So in the first iteration of it, they separated into these anterior temporal networks that are highlighted in red, and these posterior medial networks that are represented in blue. And the idea here, similar to the long axis of the hippocampus, but sometimes they say it's similar and sometimes they say that it isn't. In the posterior medial network, you have more representations of episodic information, spatial information. If you think of ideas of like reliving experiences as they occurred, that's something that's thought to be more stored in these posterior medial networks, whereas the anterior temporal networks are thought to embody more semantic information, categorical information, and affective information. So now we wanted to look at the representation of these memories across these two large-scale networks to see if we start to see a differentiation across the two, with the hypothesis that we would see more clustering in the anterior temporal networks compared to posterior medial networks. There's very few times in science, and this is to encourage grad students, where you get a home run. And when you get a home run, you like really want to savor it. And these were one of the analyses where we like got a home run, and it was really exciting. So now we're doing the exact same type of analysis I showed you before, except with AT networks and PM networks. And when we look at the similarity in the AT networks, it's exactly what we would predict, right? We're seeing that remembered high reward information is clustered more closely to each other in anterior temporal networks than forgotten information, but there's no effect for the low reward information, right? So this is the type of phenomenology that's really aligned with our CMR models and our free recall results. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night cursing that we didn't get free recall in this data to directly relate these things together. One day we will, so in 3 years, we'll try to relate the two things together. But this is a really nice neural phenotype to match our behavioral data. So then the question is this sort of happening everywhere in cortex, or is it specific for these AT networks? There's two ways we can answer this. First, in a multi-level modeling approach, we first check to see, is there just one node in the AT networks that's representing this, or is it distributed across? Making the model represent each node separately did not increase model fit, suggesting that this is better explained by sort of a Gestalt representation across the entire AT network. And then we can also look at PM networks, where we see a very different pattern, that we do see some representation that reflects memory, but it's in the only lowest of the low value information. That 1 point information is the only thing that's showing a representational difference by memory. So in some ways, it's showing a much more finer grained resolution response in the PM networks to low value information. Psychologically, I cannot understand yet what this means, like why we would have brain regions oriented to the least valuable thing that exists. But I guess there's some utility in knowing what the least valuable information is also. But now I'm just like really waving my hands around because I'm having a hard time processing this. So pay more attention to the top part because it's more exciting. Okay. How much time? Oh, nailing it. Okay, cool. So, ready for the next elaboration? There's only one more new thing.
Just like understand this figure. Is the last panel missing a line? It is, right?
Oh no, because with the multi-level modeling approach, only when a factor was significant do we show the line. So because there was no differentiation between high and low reward memory, we plotted as a single feature because we only get one weight for it because the winning model didn't differentiate. Remembered and forgotten. But if you saw them, they would just be right on top of each other if we split it.
Just one, you may want to leave this till the Q&A, but are you sure that that top figure completely accords with your prediction? So for example, there's no difference in the clustering between remembered low and remembering.
Yeah, so you're right. I guess
You're predicting that they should be much tighter.
the gray bars could afford to be a little higher. Right, like if we were doing a complete prediction of the clustering.
Yeah, so the
Results, right.
in fact, that high reward is less tightly clustered than low reward. And the interaction is driven by the looser clustering of the forgotten.
Yeah, so I think what's actually happening, and I know nothing gets by me, I think it's a combination of the results we see in the anterior hippocampus, right, where we're seeing the more clustering overall, but then the differentiation between memory and remembering and forgetting is happening in AT networks. So it's like a cross pattern that explains the results. It really stinks that we don't have free recall data on here, right? Like all the information is embedded across these two networks. One thing we didn't do is we explicitly removed the hippocampus from these networks, right? One can imagine from like an information processing space, if we put the hippocampus back into these networks, we could start to see the type of differentiation that you're talking about, that the dark green bars get lower. But because we were thinking about separating them out, we removed all hippocampal signals from here. But when I get back home, I'm going to ask the grad student to rerun these analyses, including the hippocampal clusters, to see if we see the full differentiation. Except she graduated as an industry, but I think she'll still do it. Okay.
Totally.
Okay. So during the second part, it looks like individuals are storing memories during encoding in a way that is conducive for generalization and transformation. And we think this organization is seen a lot in anterior hippocampus, but then you get another part where it gets modulated by reward and memory in anterior temporal networks. So for the last part, we want to turn up the challenge level a little bit more. It's rarely in the world where somebody's like, this has value, this doesn't, and you know it in real time, right? Often we only find out what's important until after it happens, right? So how can does the brain solve this? And if it does, how can it solve it? So now imagine, oh wait, I had a really good scenario for this. Oh, you're at the store with your friend just shopping for fun at Williams and Sonoma, like you do every Sunday, right? And they're looking at all the things, you're getting a sense of what they like and what they don't like. And then you found out, surprise, they're really into DIY home reno. I'm really struggling to make examples. Yeah. Okay. Surprise, they're really into home demo and they're going to remodel their kitchen. So you're like, oh man, I really should have been paying attention to what kitchen stuff they like. So then you'd want to go back in time and be able to have enhanced memory for the stuff that you later on is find important. I'm taking submissions for a better example for this after the talk. But okay, but we like set with the idea, you learn about value after the fact. Is there a way to then go back in time and enhance that information? So these are a bunch of projects I did with Joey Dunsmore, and Anita Patel ran the version in Reward. And what we wanted to see is basically this question: can value move backwards, and then you can enhance memory for this? So the design was purely stolen from a paper Joey did that was in Nature, and then when you follow up with Reward, it drops from Nature to learning and memory. I love learning and memory. Don't get me wrong. Okay, so what happens first? There's this pre-reward phase, and during the pre-reward phase, individuals are doing like a really simple, stupid delayed match to sample task, right? They're shown a picture, then a short delay, and they have to say which picture did they see during the cue. I think my mom has called me like 3 times in a row. I just turn this off. Okay. She's fine. She just likes to call a lot. Okay, so during this phase, half of the trials were animals, the other half of the trials were tools. Really boring, really simple. Okay, then they go to a second phase, and now in the second phase, one of the categories is associated with a high reward, and one of the categories is associated with a low reward. So in this example, animals are now associated with high reward, tools are associated with low reward. This is counterbalanced across subjects. Okay, then we tested memory at a 24-hour delay, both for the items in the pre-reward phase and the items in the reward phase. Critically, it was always trial unique images, right? So the things that showed up in the pre-reward phase were never shown again until the memory test. The things that were in the reward phase were specifically the reward phase, meaning there's no mixing of the informations in there, just the categories were continuous. And when we were in the pre-reward phase, there was no mention of reward at all. This was a nightmare for the IRB, but it was so important for the study that we could not mention reward in the IRB because we didn't want them to have any expectation of earning money when they were in the pre-reward phase. Cool. Okay, so now we're looking at the memory test. On the right-hand side is the reward data. So R plus means it was associated with reward directly. R minus means it was associated with the low reward directly. Then on the left-hand side for pretest is the information that was never associated with reward, but shared a category structure that was similar to what was later associated with reward. Sometimes sentences get so long that I lose track of what I'm saying. I think I said it all right. Okay, so what do we find? We see the standard reward effect. By now, this should be really unexciting for you. It's like the 6th plot that I've shown that shows better memory for high versus low reward information. But what was cool and exciting was that you also see this for the information that happened beforehand. So now there's sort of a categorical enhancement of information that shares a category structure that will later become rewarded. Okay. Now there's one layer that's cooler than this. Joey thought this was the cool finding. I'm the loser that thinks the other part's the cool finding, is that was a 24-hour delay paradigm. Now we're looking at a no delay condition where we gave them a short distractor task and test memory, and no effect on the pre-reward items or the reward items if you test it immediately, right? So this means that there is something really special happening between encoding and 24-hour retrieval that's giving you the ability to go backwards in time and enhance memory for related information. So, barring the ability of nonlinear temporal causality and parapsychology, how can the brain support this type of retroactive memory enhancer, right? How are we able to go back in time and tag this information that we think is important? So we were running a project in parallel before we even started thinking about these retroactive memory effects, where we just wanted to see what was happening during consolidation for rewarding items. So there's this really large animal literature looking at replay. So for people that aren't familiar with replay, while you, the rat, are moving around space, you're activating place cells around the hippocampus that represent different locations, and then say there's a reward at the end of it, right? You might then actually get engagement in the ventral striatum representing that reward. Now, what's really cool is during periods of sleep and wakeful restfulness, so when the rats are just like chilling and grooming, you'll see a rapid replay of the events in the way that they occurred during encoding, but at like a much shorter time scale. And it's now been shown that these replay events actually support memory stabilization for rewarding experiences. In parallel, you see more replay for rewarding events versus non-rewarding events, right? So that means something is happening that's able to stabilize this information in the hippocampus, is where this was looked at mostly for long-term memory. But then more recently, on top of that, people have shown this isn't a phenomenon that's just happening in the hippocampus itself, but these replay events are actually thought to train the cortex to encode that information. So it's now represented both in the hippocampus and the cortex. Or if you're an old school systems consolidation person, that's wrong. You think it would just all move to the cortex and not be in the hippocampus anymore. But there's this period of interactions between the hippocampus and cortex that's stabilizing information, right? So we were really interested to see if this actually exists in humans also, and whether it's related to reward motivated memory. So this was work that I did with Leila Davachi. This is really big in this picture, which is that important. So what we did is we used the paradigm she had used in neutral memory, adapted from Ariel Tambini. You give people a resting state scan, then we had them do a motivated encoding paradigm. We adapted this now to have category selectivity embedded in it. So you'd be associating words with either famous faces or famous places, and you're trying to bind these two things together. Then we had this short rewarded retrieval phase where we just gave them 3 trials and said, oh, congratulations, you won all the rewards, because we didn't want them rehearsing information after that. So we had this really miniature short rehearsal phase. We threw out all the data, behavioral data from there. Then we gave them another resting state scan. They thought the experiment was done. They came back 24 hours later and saw all the other stimuli except for those 2 that we used to fake them out, stop incentivizing. And they just had to pick which word was associated with the picture. And this was not incentivized, right? So again, we're trying to limit this to an encoding manipulation as best as we can. Okay, so behaviorally, we found that people had better memory. She get tired of me saying this yet. For the high reward information versus the low reward information. But now we want to know what's happening in the brain. And one part that was really exciting about this is that we could test how smart this system was, right? So in half of the subjects, faces were the rewarded category, and the other half of the subjects, scenes were the rewarded category. And what we know is that visual processing of these things in the ventral visual stream occur in different places, right? So now we can test, is the system able to dynamically shift where it's targeting based off of the value of the information? So making it more idiosyncratic to the type of knowledge that is associated with high versus low reward. So from now on the plot, you're going to see category selective cortex, but know that that's a different place depending on whether you're an even subject or an odd subject. So there's a layer of dynamics associated with it. So we take the resting state activity between these regions beforehand, afterhand, then we subtract the post minus the pre. So now we know this is something that's actually changing as a function of the learning experience. I think sort of as close to plasticity as we can get in the type of paradigm like this. And then we see how is that associated with memory across high and low rewards. So we're going back to the anterior posterior distinction again, because we thought all this should really be happening in anterior, and prior work from Ariel showed that for neutral information, it's in posterior. So we made predictions that look like this, that it would predict memory when you look at anterior hippocampus and category selective cortex for high reward information. And then you would predict the exact opposite pattern for low reward information. And again, we see a double dissociation now where it looks like connectivity of the anterior hippocampus to category selective cortex is predictive of high reward information. And for low reward information, it's the posterior hippocampus with category selective cortex. One thing that's important to note, this is just for information that's learned in the moment. So it's not an exact match to the retroactive memory enhancements. But a couple years later, Dave Cluett followed up on this, looking at it with retroactive memory enhancements. One very notable difference is they're using shocks here instead of rewards, but they do show the same effect that post-encoding interactions between the hippocampus and ventral visual stream are able to predict the ability for people to go backwards in time and enhance memory. Now I feel like I used up all my time. Okay, we'll wrap up fast. So some take-home points. Let me take a breath. An event boundary per se. Okay, so take-home points from the entire talk. I really think reward is facilitating memory well beyond just accuracy. I think as a field, we need to get over asking people yes or no questions when we look at memory, and need to start looking at memory at more three-dimensional features, because there's information embedded when you use these more memory tests that have more degrees of freedom attached to it. And I think this might really be about engaging prior knowledge networks during encoding and during consolidation. So an open question we have is, when do we wait for encoding to do it? When do we wait for consolidation to do it? I'm sure it has to do with like nuances of goal states. I'd like to ask Holly what she thinks about this quite a bit. But when do these effects sometimes show up immediately? Why do they sometimes show up late? And that we think that, you know, the anterior hippocampus really might be sort of a core coordinator, or the what do orchestras have? Who's this guy?
Conductor.
The conductor. Of this ensemble that's allowing us to have these flexible memories. We'll skip all my thoughtful parts to make sure that there is time to thank people. So all the people that did the reward memory structure, I really want to highlight Elizabeth Horvath. It was like a tour de force of running these things. And then for the reward and systems consolidation, particularly Layla and Joey helped a lot in formulating the ideas there. And then when I was putting up this ad for the Oregon Memory Group, I just really felt like we need to find a space to have like a tug of war competition with OMG and the Center for Vital Longevity. So maybe like CNS or something, we can have some sort of like competitive Olympics. And like UC Davis isn't even invited. Okay. Cool. But thank you so much for listening, and I'm really happy to answer any questions.
I'm really interested in some of the valence effects. So at the beginning of your talk, you kept saying you don't find this with threat, or we don't find this with, losses. And then at the end of your talk, you're finding things with the threat of shock. So why do you think you're finding this effect sometimes with threats of shock, or finding punishments and sometimes not?
I think there's something to do. Well, you know how I feel about this. I don't love the word valence at all, but sometimes you just have to use it. But I really like to think of like urgency with things happening. So I think with the threat of shock paradigms, like incentive is a very urgent and in your face, right? Where with the reward paradigms, you have like a little bit more breathing room. And all those studies that we ran beforehand where I said they were different, those were all incentives happening in the moment. For the retroactive memory enhancement stuff, the shock is happening later and it's predicting the backwards thing. So I don't know if it's that there's like flexibility in the system, because like the threat, I think, can cause a lot of attentional divergence for it. But in the case of the retroactive memory enhancements, there's no reinforcement happening there at all. So it may have more like degrees of freedom to go backwards in time versus the reinforcer being there in general. My other idea is that Joey didn't turn the shock up high enough in the scanner, and that explains. But no, this is like a really hard problem of when they separate and when they differentiate. And I've been really thinking now it's just about like, how much flexibility do you have in your mental space? And like threat happens to limit that more often, and reward happens to make it bigger. But we also know that like when you have a really high intensity reward, you end up looking like threat too. So it's sort of a like still a little bit of a mess of like when and where it happens. But I do think the retroactive thing is because you have more space between where the memory effect is happening versus that.
So you were focusing on encoding and consolidation, which is perfectly sensible. But you can get reward effects at retrieval. So you probably know
Rachel
Elwood did a great study when she was in my lab showing if you don't tell people until after encoding, just before retrieval, which class of memories are going to be more rewarding than the other, you can modulate memory performance and also modulate reward signals associated with successful retrieval of the two kinds. Have you followed up on anything like that?
I haven't, but Holly has done a lot of the work with retrieval, a beautiful cognition paper that says you get a lot of things with response biases that occur too.
You have to correct for those.
Right, you have to correct for those. So I think the question is, and Rachel's data is really exciting because it brought up this whole like recollection network in tandem, right? So I think there's an interesting question, like I'm showing here that you can get these by encoding manipulations if the representational hierarchy exists, but I think we need to basically like follow up on the both of your works to look at some of these more free-form measures of recall to see if we see the structure there. one very, very far away version of looking at this, thanks to Kendra for funding it through SRDNA, is that we've been manipulating like reward like goal states during retrieval. So we're saying like share this memory to a friend versus share this memory like it's boring, you know? So there's like something a little bit more rewarding about sharing information to a friend. And we do see a shift from using less episodically detailed language to more semantically detailed knowledge when you're sharing with a friend. I know it's like 3 standard deviations away from where you're asking, but I think we at least know that people will restructure information on the fly with recall. And I think restructuring that information towards semanticness, I don't know how rewarding it is for them, but for the people listening to the memories, they enjoyed it a lot more when it was more semantic and less episodic, right? So these are like very discrete puzzle pieces, but I think it would, something in between those two studies suggests that we would get similar effects via retrieval manipulation. And I've been more interested in that now that we've been playing with CMR. I have to come to terms that I'm 40 and I have to start caring about retrieval. Now I dodged it for 35 years, but yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question that we just haven't gotten to yet.
Maybe it just makes me think about what's in a reward. What's the reward? Like I said, it was manipulated about money amount, right? That's one kind of reward. If you stretch it all the way, is finding structure in the world a reward?
Well, no, that's another talk. No, I know. It's hard. We started this line, like, use a sledgehammer sometime when you want to look at something. Giving people reward incentives is a giant sledgehammer, right? We started, I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago. We've been looking at agency manipulations and information seeking. So, how do you acquire prior knowledge? How do you build knowledge structures? And then how do you use that to structure memory? And across 3 behavioral studies with that, we haven't been able to image it yet. We're seeing that agency. So I think this idea of like, I'm now manipulating the world, you would assume that is in order to build structure, right? And there we see enhancements in temporal order memory quite a bit, right? So people are more likely to learn the sequence of events that are occurring when you give them agency over that information, which in some ways is structure. We haven't figured out a paradigm that would do that hierarchically yet, like we see with, we haven't really done it. We only have one study doing it with free recall. And there, the only thing we see that it's enhancing is temporal order memory. But I think that's like heading to the point that, yeah, this isn't about earning money. Like that's like stupid and new, right? I think it's about just like finding something important. And when you find something important, you want to attach meaning to it. And we can see a lot of similar effects by just like allowing people to freely explore. Unless they're freely exploring in a threatening context, we don't see those effects as much.
I think for me, because you were thinking about the flexible, the higher level, and like so to get kind of into that, you'd have to break away from just the money, right? Because that
yeah. And what's interesting that we have data on, if I say this concisely, we have a paradigm where people are accruing knowledge to open up treasure chests, and then there's incidental memory for the treasure chest. And only when you have like partial information but not full information, that's when we see the memory enhancement. So when you're basically hypothesis testing, and that memory benefit looks like it's being predicted by hippocampal VMPFC coupling, which is again this idea of building prior knowledge in these anterior temporal networks, which then enhances memory. So it might be like everything might be curiosity and about closing information gaps, and reward is just like one easy way to tap into that. But again, going to Holly's point, threat is not about curiosity. It's about like freaking out and running away.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Great talk. So, I've always found the observations showing the resting state correlations changing as a function of memory signals and memory demands really interesting. And I think you rightfully motivated it with some of the earlier work looking at replay and pre-play signals. But clearly those are very different forms of information processing, right? We're not just neuronal activity, talking about maybe slow cortical potentials or low frequency signals. How do you link those conceptually? Have you thought about what the relationship between those two sets of observations are?
So this is going to be pretty unsatisfying in general, and I'm actually surprised that nobody has done both. So I'm in the camp that really is caring about the systems consolidation point. So I'm motivated with replay, but I'm actually more motivated by the old lesion studies more than anything. So we're really interested in like cross-regional coupling with that. There's another group of students in the world, and like Layla switched over to this camp, as has Ariel, where they're looking for reactivation, spontaneous reactivation during rest. So Bernhard, Teresina, Ariel Tambini, and Anna Shapiro have shown similar relationships, not in the context of reward, but post-encoding, spontaneous reinstatement during rest, predicting 24-hour memory. And to show that it's not an epiphenomenon, Ariel has data where she's actually TMS, ventral visual stream, during rest, and shows that she can disrupt that relationship. That's still pretty far. I mean, that's showing that there's this other world of reactivation that could be doing it. There was a student that had reanalyzed our data in Ken Norman's lab that was showing that in micro periods where she was looking at reactivation in the hippocampus. We saw a reactivation event in the hippocampus for reward. Those were the same moments as micro periods of increased connectivity between the hippocampus and ventral visual stream, which again is like getting closer to the idea that there might be a reactivation moment that's closer to replay that is then driving the coordinated efforts. But I don't even think we should pretend to connect. I mean, I did it because that's what we do. But no, I think it's like ludicrous to think that we're showing replay when we're looking at these reactivation events. And maybe some of the intracranial data will show it, but it hasn't. And people have been looking, right? So it gives a question of like, we're not a rat walking around. So yeah, I don't know how relevant like replay is to this stuff, but I do think it matches pretty well with vision data. So sorry for being disingenuous 20 minutes ago. But no, I think it's actually somebody should do neuroimaging in the rats to see if when they're actually having replay events, are they getting something that looks like a hemodynamic reactivation signal or not? Because I think that'd be the only way we could solve that.
Yeah, have people done like multi-site play studies?
They've done multi-site replay. Lauren Frank has looked. Yeah, so there's coordinated activity between the hippocampus and ventral visual stream, and whatever they call the PFC in the rat.
And
right.
the replays coordinate to something like a CP?
They're sitting. So when they do it in sleep, they're sitting on top of the peaks of the theta cycle, right? The theta gamma coupling cycle. They're showing it the replay events there, and that's where the most coordinated activity is because there's like reduced inhibition in the cortex during those moments. So they've shown that, and they can disrupt that and disrupt memory. For the awake version of it, I don't know if they've put them all together yet. They've only done it during the sleep.
So it's all occurring during the sharp wave ripples.
Right.
So Brad Legger, my collaborator, has been looking for sharp wave ripples
And human EEG?
in human
Yeah, and it's been hard, right? Like it's and I don't know if it's difficult just from a technology standpoint or if there's there.
Finding
NIMH.
Oh, Zach.
Cool.
Yeah.
I mean, he
But
has a
depending how
one
they
paper.
define those, like he has a very liberal way of defining.
yes, it's very
Yeah, I'm a little suspect of how much of a one-to-one mapping it is, and I think we need to like
So it's
take a step back in the field and not just try to show rodent things existing in humans, but like figure out what the human like conceptual homolog is, because it's like it would be really bizarre if it was a one-to-one mapping, like really bizarre. I don't know that much about the intracranial world, but like I said, a lot of people that know more about this stuff than I do in this room.
Is there any question online, Camilla?
Yes, there's two questions. The first question reads, how does your memory model distinguish between short-term memories with dopamine signaling versus long-term memories with serotonin signaling?
Oh, I've never thought about serotonin. I mean, I've thought about it in the context of therapy, but I haven't really thought about it much in the context of learning signals there. One thing, the question I thought it was going to be is, what do you think about dopamine in terms of like its role in short-term memory? There's like all this gorgeous, so I'm answering another question. There's all this gorgeous work by Pat Coleman-Rakish and a lot of people after that about like fine-tuning signal to noise and working memory representations of prefrontal cortex by dopamine. And then there's this like completely separate field by Tony Grace and John Listman looking at dopamine in the hippocampus. And I pray for the animal people to start combining these two things together to try to see what the dopamine signals are doing contemporaneously, because we know they're released to both regions at the same time, and often without releasing it explicitly to the striatum, which should give us some insights that these are coordinated structures. And there's some work showing that if you like systemically increase dopamine, you'll see increased theta coupling between the MTL and prefrontal cortex, which suggests that like short-term memory and long-term memory are probably the same thing, maybe. I don't know if that's controversial or not, but my guess is that they're the same thing, and dopamine influences both of them, but the fields have just been separate in the way they looked at it. And luckily, online people can't follow up.
Okay, the second question, does your memory model explain how non-adaptive memory like political propaganda, oh Lord, disinformation persuade voting choices that are actually harmful to such voters' genuine self-interest and thus quite non-adaptive?
I would never touch that question with a 20-foot.
I edited,
I'll skip out all the political parts and say, yes, it can be maladaptive. So we've been studying like, if you overtax the system, like too much dopamine or too much salience detection in the BTA, we've been studying this in the context of psychosis quite a bit, and have data that shows that it makes them, or individuals with psychosis as a group, not at the individual level, as a massive group, show sort of more engagement of anterior temporal networks, as well as more BTA and hippocampal coupling, and more reliance on internal schemas rather than temporal context during free recall. And we're speculating here that if you put those three things together, it's sort of like a breeding ground for delusions. Like you can imagine, if you think everything's important, you're no longer using vertical information and you're gluing them together in prior knowledge stores, that's an easy way to form something like a delusion or paranoia. We haven't been able to actually get these signals to match positive symptom assessments, but the positive symptom assessments, no offense to the world of clinical, it's a hard job, but they're really clunky, right? So it's hard to get like, nobody has a real, I mean, the data we have doesn't have refined scales of like, how bad are your like delusions, or what's the sort of dimensionality of your delusions. So we've yet to put all the pieces together, but I do think there's a way that too much of the system could cause like overgeneralization and sort of misattribution, and then no comments on how that relates to political stuff while I'm being recorded. But if you want to send me an email, I'll say all the comments. Yeah. Thank you, Brent.
Great job.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Great question.
Yeah.